Beautiful. G'day Jafffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. Well, some of you guys have been wondering what's been happening with the FJ45, and today we're going to pick up where I left off. If you're not interested, there's the door. Don't let it hit you on the ass on the way out. I've been busy patching up and panel beating these doors. Along the bottom edge of the doors here, there was a bunch of cancer and it was all rotted out. So I put some patch panels down in there, welded it all up. If you have a look down that seam, she's as straight as an arrow. So these two doors are now finished, just need to be blocked with 400 and then 600, and then they're ready to be sprayed with the final color. And here's the color that I'm considering spraying it. This is called Prussian Steel, and it's a Holden and an HSV color. This is what it looks like in the sun, and under some LED light, this is what it looks like. It's kind of a metallic gray-green color if I was going to try and describe it. Anyway, haven't completely landed on that yet, but that's where my headspace is. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. But the video today is not about doors. You want to see what I'm about to tackle? Stick around. So when we last left off, I was working on this bonnet scoop off of a 79 Series Cruiser. This is the early model 79 with the lower hump, not the higher hump. I think the lower hump will just suit the proportions of this vehicle better. And I was struggling with a few things. First of all, I want to use this plastic insert. I just reckon that gives it a much more finished look. I quite like that. That is made out of plastic, probably an ABS plastic. The scoop itself is so wide that it's going to interfere with these gills here, but its length is pretty good. So, you know, I was doing things like contemplating cutting this down so that the bonnet was at one level, dropping the nose down a little bit. That would mean the scoop would be wide enough and it wouldn't be interfering with that body line. But all of it was a compromise. So here's where I've landed. I think what I'm going to do is slice this bonnet skin right down the middle and section it. Probably take 50 or 75 mil out of the guts of the thing. That solves all my body line problems, but it introduces a new problem, and that problem is this scoop. That'll no longer fit once I section this bonnet. So that means I'm going to have to cut that as well, and I'm going to have to try and plastic weld that together. Now, I've never done any plastic welding before, and I was reticent to give that a crack, but I think this is my best option. Section it, squeeze it together, chop the same amount out of the middle of this scoop, bring that together, Bob's your uncle. So that's my plan. Wish me luck. Now, there's a couple of ways I can do this. I can measure in from both sides and determine how much I want to take out, but that relies on me getting measurements accurate, and I'm never very good at that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split it right down the guts, then I'm going to lay the two pieces over top of one another to get my width, and then I'll cut it on that overlap that I've done, and that'll get me the proper width, and it'll also get the cut line perfect so that when I weld it together, it'll butt up just wonderfully. So I've got a little dimple here, which is dead center, and I got that little square there, which is dead center. So I reckon if I run this tape right across the guts of those two, that's going to get me pretty bloody close. This doesn't need to be super accurate because, as I said, I'm going to be overlapping the two over top of one another. But this will get me pretty close to the center line. Just to make sure that I haven't gone wonky on this back edge, got 295 to that edge from the little squirters, and 297 from that side. 2 mil run, I can deal with that. Lay down a straight edge and just make sure something hasn't gone completely wonky. That's as close to center as I can get. Now I'll mark my tape so I know which side of the line to cut on. I've been known to do that before, hack on the wrong side. All right, here we go. No turning back now. Yikes. Part A. Part B. Let's get our back edge lined up nicely. Get our side blended nicely on this side. Do the same on this side. So I've just got some clamps here holding these two pieces together, and I'm working out my width. And while I was doing that, I'm looking at the scoop placement relative to the rest of the bonnet. And if I've got the back edge of this scoop lined up with the back of the bonnet, the actual hole in the scoop looks too far forward to me. Looks too dicky. So I think what I'm gonna have to do is move the scoop back, probably somewhere about there, just forward of these gills. That means I got this whole back edge of this bonnet hanging over the side. And this has got these funky compound curves all through it. So what I think I'm gonna have to do then is section it across this way and shift this whole piece forward so I don't have to deal with panel beating these compound curves. I'm good at working on flats. I'm not good at working on funky curves like this. So let me wiggle and jiggle this thing around a little bit and see whether I can get the proper placement forward to back on the bonnet and left to right. And that'll dictate how much of these two sections I have overlapping one another. Okay, my preliminary measurements are done. And there's very few angles that I can use to get this thing square, because it needs to be square left to right, but also the pitch or the angle. So I've taken a straight edge along the edge of these gills here, and I've run a line off the back of them, and I've run a line off the front of them. And I've assumed that these marks here, which are where the bonnet scoop sort of affixes to, are the same on both sides, and they look it. And I've measured from that edge there over to that edge. So that's 145. Same thing on this side, from that edge to that edge, 145. What that's done is that's squared the bonnet up this way. On the back side, I've done similar. I've got a parallel line running off of those gills, and I measured from that squirter to that line there, which was about 235, and I did the same thing on the other side. From there to that line, again, that's about 235. That squared the scoop up on the back end of the bonnet. So I'm pretty confident that that scoop is sitting square on the bonnet where it needs to be. Next question is front to back. And it's a little bit difficult to tell because we've got an overhang hanging there. So we kind of got to block that out of our vision. And of course the bonnet's not sitting on the car. So I got my imaginator here. And if we just block that out there along the back of the bonnet, that's roughly how the scoop's going to sit. And that looks pretty good in terms of its front to back position. It's not quite perfectly in the center because I measured that distance to the front of the bonnet and I measured that distance to the rear of the bonnet, and it's about 40 mil forward. However, I reckon that if I move that thing 20 odd mil back, the back of that scoop is going to come pretty close to parallel with those gills. And I'd like a little bit of separation distance between those two. I just think it would look better to the eye. So that's it. I'm pretty happy with where that's positioned. I'll draw a line on this scoop here and along the back edge here. I'll separate those two halves. I'll get my flapper disc out. I'll clean the paint off and I'll just spot weld these two halves together so when I cut them, they're not shifting around on me. The other thing I've done is I put two random marks on either side of the front of this scoop and I measured between those two marks, 336 mil. And on the back of the bonnet, I just measured between the two squirter holes at 525. So when I separate these two halves and I put them back together to weld them, I can get them back exactly to the distance that I had them here. There, now that I've got the panel welded up so she doesn't shift, I can split it down the guts and allow me to butt weld it. There we go, perfect cut for a butt weld. All right, I got my cut line all cleaned up now. I'm gonna go ahead and spot weld that before I cut that overlap on the front apart to keep this line true. Okay, now I'll just rinse and repeat on this front cut. That's all snipped, ready for a butt weld. Just going along with my finger, checking to make sure the panel is level on either side, which it is. That'll do us, donkey. There's our scoop all tack welded. Now let's get this thing fitted up to the bonnet so that we can go ahead and chop out a section in that direction. Okay, that bonnet scoop is now down and in place and where it's going to go. I got it tech screwed to the underlying bonnet. Now I got to take that much out, which is about 140 mil, to bring the back side of this scoop forward. And to do that, I'm going to cut this down the guts. Now, like a shitty chess player that doesn't think enough moves in advance, I might have just checkmated myself. And the reason being is these two sides of the scoop, that side there and that side there, are not parallel, but they run in towards one another. So when I section that bonnet scoop and take my 140 mil out, these edges aren't going to line up. All right, I don't know how I'm going to deal with that yet, but I know I got to deal with it. But let me start by drawing a center line here and chopping the ass end of this sucker off. I got two parallel lines marked. That one is parallel with the front side of the scoop. That one is parallel with these two little squirter holes. So I know that they're dead straight. I'll just measure the distance between those two and run a line right down the center and chop that out. 310 mil there. Half of that is what, 155. I'll measure up off this bottom line, 155. Double check, 155, sweet. All right, there's our cut line on the inside edge of that tape. Just as I suspected, we got that to deal with. One there, one over there. The only way I can think of dealing with that is to cut this sucker down the guts again and section out another little piece of it. All right, I'll measure from the back of these little squirters to the back of the bonnet. 169, 169. So I know that this panel is square to the back of the bonnet. I'll get a couple of tech screws and screw these two panels together. And I'll double check my measurements, make sure they haven't moved. 169, 169. Pull my clamps off now. Now I can get my cutoff disc and cut right through the guts. Then I'll have my two butt welded joints at the proper length. Then I'll have to section this to get these guys straight. We butt weld that up and line that curvature up, butt weld that up and line that curvature up, and that's how much we got to take out of the center. Looks like about 10 or 15 mil on the back side. That's gonna do it. That's gonna get ourselves a scoop rescued. Sweet. Okay, now it's time to stitch this whole thing together. All right, this first weld is a pretty important one because that lines me up to get this hump just perfect. That's good. That's real good. Then I'll do one over on this end. And now one in the middle. All right, I got that side tacked in. I got that side tacked in. Now I've got this overlap here to deal with. So I'll just run my cutting disc about 1 millimeter inside of the top overlap, and it'll chop the bottom one off as well. And then I'll butt weld those two ends together. And that should be our hot cross bun, all reassembled. Okay, I got it. I'll just tack weld that together and then I'll pop it on here for fitment. All right, that's all stitched up. Now I'm just going to get my hammer and dolly, panel beat these a little bit, try to relieve some of the pressure on them. Then we'll pop this bonnet scoop back on and look at it from a fitment point of view. That's better, that's come down quite nicely. That's laid in there pretty good too. Okay, I'll drop a couple more spot welds in here. We'll fit this up to the bonnet. And there is the bonnet scoop laying down on a level bonnet. And that looks bloody good. I'm really happy with the way that that is starting to take shape. The proportions are right. It's positioned into the bonnet, front to back, in good proportions. And from side to side, the proportions look good too. Okay, what's next? I'll go around with my pencil and I'll mark out the perimeter of this bonnet so that I can take the scoop off and grind the paint off for welding. There's two more areas that I have to address. You can see that that scoop is sitting a little bit proud. And the reason for that is right below here is where the bonnet hinges bolt to. So I'm gonna have to chop those mounts for the bonnet hinges out of the original Toyota metal, and I'll mount them up here on this 79 series, and that goes for both sides. Once those are chopped out of there, I suspect that scoop is going to lay quite nice and quite flat against the underlying bonnet. You can see on both sides I made a little bit of a boo-boo. I cut a little bit too much of the underlying skin out, so I'll have to patch that triangle there, and that one there on the other side. That, however, is not a boo-boo. Running down the center of the original Toyota bonnet is this little raised area, and that runs through right to the very end of the bonnet. I think that would look too dicky on this bonnet scoop, so I've chopped it out of there, and I'll replace a flat sheet of metal in there. Okay, I am going to scribe around the perimeter of this bonnet scoop now. I've taken my flapper disc and I've taken all the paint off. And now it's cutting time. I'm going to cut on a little bit of an angle to try and close the gap up on the width of this wheel a little bit. Okay, you'll notice that I did not cut through here on either side. That's because I've got this brace here and I don't want to cut through that brace. I also haven't cut the back side of this bonnet yet, which I'll do shortly. And I'll actually take that cut from this side of these hinges and I'll take that off in one big piece because I want to reuse this hinge affair here on the scoop, on the top of the scoop itself. Okay, I'll measure back, call it 150. That'll clear that brace on the bottom side. Good. Just make sure we're going to clear our brace on the bottom side. It's 130. Sweet. Not super critical that this is completely dead accurate and straight on this edge, but I would like to get it as close as possible. All right, I got my line. Cutty time. All right, now I can do my cut along this back edge. Ta-da! Now that I've got a hole cut out around the perimeter, I'm going to very lightly tack this scoop into place. Now it's important I get this as square in the hole as possible. Get it sitting left to right so that my gap is as small as possible on both sides. Well, I've got this donor cab that I've been sort of scabbing parts off of. It's a bloody good thing that I've had it because I need it to actually mock this bonnet up. There's a couple of critical measurements that I need to get right. One is the placement of those bonnet hinges. If I get those too far forward or too far back or too far left or right to ensure that that gap there is correct, forward to back, and that gap there is correct, left to right. Now, I appreciate the panels aren't all that crash hot in terms of aligning on these 45s, but I'd like to get it as close as I can. So that's one thing I've got to get right. The other bit that I've got to get right, let me shift that out of the road, is the curvature of this panel, because this panel here has got a slight curve to it. And at the moment, this panel is running pretty much flat across. So I've got to make sure that the curvature of the back of this scoop matches the curvature on the body. But I think my first task will be chopping these guys out and incorporating them into the back of the scoop using my bonnet hinge as a locator. But how's it look so far? It's a little bit difficult to visualize because you got that patchwork quilt effect, but I'm happy with the placement of that scoop. Now it might look a little bit far forward if I pop this sucker in place, and I can only pop it in place on one end because remember I've got to section that as well. That's roughly what she's going to sit like. And as you can see, the hole for that scoop is back here. And I think that just about nails it. I think I can visualize it a little bit better on this side. Okay, first things first, let's work on these hinges. Okay, I got my little hinge plates cut out of the bit of steel that was on the original bonnet. I've screwed these hinges in place. Now I'll line these holes up. I'll try to get this bonnet hinge as centered as possible. Front to back and side to side. I'll hit about there. Then I'll put this bonnet plate in place, centering those holes. And I'll get my scribe, slide my holes in place. Sweet. There's my 3 holes. Now I'll get a center pop. Now some tech screws, just to drill a hole. Now I'll get my plate. Okay, let's check our hinge. Make sure it covers those bolt holes properly, which it does. All right, that's the location of this raised area on my scoop. So I'll take my wheel, I'll cut this out, and I'll weld that piece into the underlying skin. Got my cut on my hinge area marked out. Let's choppy choppy. There we go. Take my screws out and I can weld that in place. Now the panels are all cleaned up. I'm going to tack weld these little suckers in place. Just making sure that I'm as level as I can be. Looking good so far. Alrighty, that one is in place. I'll do the exact same thing on the other side, and we'll meet back and put this bonnet back on and see whether those holes are in the right place. All right, let's get our bonnet back in place. That's gonna blow out the foo-foo valve of my back if I do that too many more times. Get our gaps lined up as best we can. Excellent. Those holes line perfectly up. This side, excellent. Those holes line perfectly up. All right, we'll call that a win. Nice one. All right, now I got to finish off the bottom edge of this scoop. On the Toyota factory bonnet, it just came flat, and then it had a little L shape on the bottom along here. And then once it got past the hinges, it actually pinched around and folded back in on itself. So the only thing I need to do is construct that L, but that L is going to give this the curvature that it needs. And that's going to be the critical part, making sure that I've got that rolling at the same curvature as this panel here. I think that's a tomorrow problem now because I am brain dead. Bye, Felicia's. All right, now I got to finish up the back of these hinge areas. And you can see they got a bit of a profile to them. And the reason for that is so that the hinge lies flat on the bonnet, because the bonnet curves down a little bit. Therefore, you need that little bit of a step up to get that hinge to lie flat. Now I got some old shitty pieces of, I think it's floor. It might even be transmission tunnel, but anyway, what it does have on it, it's got that little bit of a step profile that I need. So I've cut myself out a small little piece, which I'll weld in there to continue that profile on. And then the back of the original bonnet skin, which I kept, I'll weld that little sucker in there, and it's got a step built into it. And those two steps should marry up with one another. That's the plan anyway. All right, now that little piece there welds in there, finishes off that angle quite nicely. So I will tack it in here, and I'll probably go up to about here, but I won't go any further along the bonnet here, because remember, that's got a little bit of a hump in it, and I've got to determine where that hump sits before I go ahead and weld that in, because as soon as I weld that L shape in, it's going to maintain that curvature that I decide on. Okay, that's about as far as I want to weld it along this length so that I can adjust that curvature should I need to. I'm going to rinse and repeat this on the other side and we'll reconvene after that. Okay, I finished up a couple of the boring bits that doesn't make really good viewing. One, I put that patch panel in there. I filled in those two little triangles, one there, and I finished up welding that length along the back side of the bonnet. That's what she looks like from the back side. All right, if I put my straight edge on the back of this bonnet, she is dead straight. That is awesome. The back of the bonnet rolls away just past these hinges on both sides, which is what it's meant to do. Okay, I think I'm ready to drop this on that donor body and see how she looks. It's already getting a heap more rigid now, which is awesome. I still got to put the skin underneath of the bonnet, but it is getting a lot more solid now. Center our bonnet hinges and shift it left to right. Bonnet hinges won't drop down because I got daggy welds there at the moment. That's all cool. All right, let's have a look-see. Yeah, that's looking better. It's really hard to visualize when you got the different parts of different color, but I'm liking what I'm seeing. Looks good, doesn't look out of place. All right, next step, I'm gonna fully weld that in, grind my welds down, then I'll shoot it with some primer, get it all the same color, and that'll help with this visualization. Yep, we are getting there. A lot of work, but we are getting there.